It took about 4,000 spores to kill 50% of our monkeys. We went through over 4,000 monkeys.
There was research going on outside the labs as well. From 1949 to 1969, government airplanes sprayed simulants of toxic agents over American cities and military facilities. They weren't trying to make people sick, rather to see how the materials might accumulate on city streets or battleship decks. And it was all done, more or less, covertly.
In the late 1970s, for the first time, the American public learned that the Army had conducted open-air germ warfare tests. They were called vulnerability tests. Initially, the Army acknowledged that as many as a half-dozen outdoor tests had been done in which what they called simulants were spread around various locations. These simulants were sprayed in the city of Minneapolis, in St. Louis, Panama City, Florida, Corpus Christi, Texas. They packed bacteria into light bulbs, dropped them onto the tracks of subway system in New York, released them from slow-moving cars through Minneapolis. Washington National Airport, men came in carrying suitcases with tiny perforations. All of them proved, quote-unquote, successful. That is, they would have killed lots of people.
In 1969, President Richard Nixon called a halt to America's offensive biological weapons program. He did it in part to pressure other countries to follow suit.
Mankind already carries in its own hands too many of the seeds of its own destruction. By the examples that we set today, we hope to contribute to an atmosphere of peace and understanding between all nations.
There was concern about the potential strategic use of biological weapons against U.S. cities, that they could become a poor man's atom bomb and pose a real strategic threat to the United States. It was not in our interest to democratize mass destruction capabilities. Nixon's decision was not driven by moral factors, but strictly by political and strategic interests.
Nixon's announcement spurred the world to try once more to control germ weapons. The result was the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention of 1972. The treaty has 146 member nations. It prohibits the development, production, possession, stockpiling, and transfer of biological weapons. But there is no mandated verification system. That has undermined the intent of the treaty and led to abuses that haunt us to this day.
Nixon did, thank goodness, get the U.S. out of this business. But at the very time that he sat down at the negotiating tables with the Soviets to craft the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention, plans were being hatched in Moscow to ratchet up their biowarfare program to an unbelievable level.
It was a huge program employing 60,000 people in labs and production facilities around the Soviet Union. Local people were as unaware of what was happening in their own backyards as the United States government was. One of the largest germ factories was near Stepnogorsk. The Soviets were stockpiling an estimated 20 tons of plague, more than 100 tons of anthrax, and 20 tons of smallpox, enough to kill millions of people, all because they believed the United States was continuing its germ research as well.
The Soviet Union's offensive biological weapons program, I can say it was the most powerful, the most sophisticated, the most comprehensive offensive biological weapons program ever established in the world.
Ken Allenbeck headed the Stepnogorsk biowarfare facility. Its weapons labs have been dismantled, and other parts of the facility are being converted to peaceful uses. Alibek also was second in command of the entire Soviet operation. In 1992, after the fall of the Soviet Union, he defected to the United States.
At first, U.S. intelligence was so stunned by his information that they thought it was disinformation. They refused to believe it. But gradually, during a year of debriefing, his evidence was so compelling that they finally admitted that it was true.
I came to work for the Soviet Union's offensive biological weapons program in 1975. I needed to develop a technological process which could allow to manufacture 300 or even more tons of anthrax a year.
There was a very sophisticated mechanism for concealing the activities of the biopreparat system, and it was done under a series of covers. The outside world was told one thing. The people who were actually working at the facility were told another cover story, and only the senior officials at the plant and in the Politburo actually knew what was going on at these facilities.
Yeah, this is building 221. It's the biggest building at the facility for cultivation of anthrax.
Under the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention, signatories inspect one another's facilities. It was Alibek's job to keep American inspectors in the dark.
The major task was just to prove that the Soviet Union didn't have any offensive biological weapons program. I was a strong supporter of this program. And you know, when I got an order to develop this cover-up story, I strongly believed that it's my major responsibility and I need to do everything possible not to let Americans and British scientists find out what it actually was.
Then in 1991, Alibek was part of a Soviet team inspecting American biological warfare facilities. All through his career, he'd been told that the United States had an active program. But what he saw here was rusting equipment and forgotten buildings.
Can you imagine when somebody who spent 15 or 17 years of his life developing biological weapons, and suddenly you realize, of course, that everything you did was absolutely not unnecessary. It was something. It was your life was wasted because you have been lied for years. And suddenly, of course, it's a mixture of anger, disappointment, frustration, of course, everything. This big tank was for collecting concentrated anthrax.
Alibek now profits from his experience and knowledge. He runs a company that's developing biological defenses, and he issues a warning. Inspections can give a false sense of security.
You need to understand all limitations of this type of inspections. So you can detect, you can say, okay, guys, this facility is a very suspicious facility, but in many cases you wouldn't be able to prove your case. On-site inspections, of course, we need to continue this work, but you shouldn't believe that this way is going to protect you against biological weapons.
With modern biotechnology, it's no longer necessary for there to be large stocks of these materials. Rather, they can be brewed up in a matter of days to weeks in sort of a just-in-time kind of philosophy. So there's nothing to detect except intent, and intent is a very, very hard thing to measure.
Today, Stepnogorsk is an example of what can be done to undo this legacy. There is an ongoing effort to turn what was a factory of death and disease into a benign industrial complex. It is largely American support that is helping to reinvent these facilities in the former Soviet Union. The Pokrov facility developed huge quantities of lethal pathogens. Now it produces vaccines. And the Vector Lab shares with the Centers for Disease Control in the United States the responsibility for safeguarding the last of the smallpox virus. This can be used to help develop new treatments and vaccines. But swords don't turn into plowshares by themselves. Republican Senator Richard Lugar and then Democratic Senator Sam Nunn created the Nunn-Lugar Act in 1991. It helps cover the ongoing costs of protecting and reducing arms stockpiles in the former Soviet Union.
The problem of resources to deal with weapons of mass destruction, first of all, to guard them so they don't get away, and secondly, to actually destroy that which is unnecessary, and that is almost all of it now, both in Russia and the United States. The disparities here are enormous.
Nunn believes that cooperation should move urgently to the next level.
We ought to be forming a partnership between our biological scientists. We need their scientists. They not only know how to make anthrax and smallpox and weaponize it, but they know how to make anthrax and smallpox that is resistant to our antibiotics and to our vaccines.
There's another problem. With the Russian economy a mess, it's vital to make sure these scientists have legitimate work in Russia or elsewhere, and won't be tempted by dictators or terrorists who would pay vast sums for their expertise.
The United States is helping to keep some of these people employed, but maybe we're not doing enough to keep all of them employed. And it wouldn't surprise me one bit to know that some of them have gone to work for some of our unsavory regimes in this world, perhaps Iran, Iraq, and a few others.
Iraq's Saddam Hussein bought his conventional weapons from the Soviet Union throughout the Cold War years. But Saddam did not like depending on a single supplier when it came to his ability to wage war.
Actually, weapons of mass destruction as an idea came into Saddam's mind gradually in the early 70s as a result of unreliability of Soviet supplies of arms.
Qadir Hamza ran Iraq's nuclear weapons program in the early 1990s. When Hamza defected in 1994, he told of Iraq's pursuit of weapons of mass destruction, including its chemical and biological program.
Strangely, Iraq can manufacture chemical and biological weapons easily, and possibly eventually nuclear weapons, but cannot make a tank or even a rifle. Iraq, buys rifles from the Soviet Union at $1,200 a shot. So the Soviet Union at the time was selling us weapons at very high price. So the alternative turned out to be much cheaper. Biological and chemical weapons are much cheaper, okay, more available to us and under our control than conventional weaponry imported from abroad.
Iraq used chemicals in the 1980s in the war against its neighbor Iran. Companies in 21 countries, including the United States, sold Iraq many of the supplies it needed to develop its weapons of mass destruction. Then Saddam used gas against his own citizens, ethnic Kurds fighting for independence in northern Iraq. More than 7,000 Kurds, including women, children, and the elderly, may have died in the gas attacks in 1988. In the town of Alabja, Abbas Abed was one of those gassed.
They were flying so low that we could see the Iraqi flags underneath the planes.
The attack started with planes dropping conventional cluster bombs.
The Iraqis were constantly bombarding with small rockets so people would go into hiding inside cellars. They bombed with the small rockets to blow out all the windows and doors so there would be clear passage for the gas through the buildings. It was obvious that the Iraqis planned their bombing very carefully. It was almost 3 o'clock when from our basement we started to smell garlic, apple, or liquid gas. We thought a bomb had hit liquid gas tanks in the kitchen or a neighboring house and they had exploded. When a man who had run out came back holding a piece of cloth on his face, he said, "Get out and save yourselves as soon as you can. Buildings and basements are no protection." Every 3 or 4 meters you would stumble over the dead bodies of 5 to 6 children and women, and the farther you went, the more dead bodies you would see.